This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Ghannam.
And I'm Jamal Dajani.
Well, Jamal, as we're on weeks after the attack on Palestinian civilians in Gaza and the West Bank, actually, Palestinians worldwide continue to feel unsafe and under attack, whether it's in Sheikh Jarrah, where Palestinians continue to be, attempted to be ethnically cleansed by Israeli settlers, or the catastrophic consequences in Gaza for Palestinians. Palestinians are safe nowhere in the world, Jamal, including here in the United States, because, attacks on our First Amendment rights, attacks on free speech, attacks on the ability to criticize the apartheid regime of Israel, the husband machine is really ramping up, Jamal, and Arab Talk and some of your posts on Facebook are at the center of it right now.
You're absolutely right, Jess, and this is the time to reclaim the narrative that Facebook and other social media giants are trying to hijack, but also to really recapture the narrative from the U.S. government when you have a Secretary of State
exactly
who basically and unequivocally says all the time that Israel has the right to defend itself and not mourning the death of more than 60 Palestinian children. I mean, this is the issue, and trying to say, well, we're trying to be fair and balanced, but we'll talk about actually a video of his first, which is really important. The very first interview is with Gillian York, the Electronic Frontier Foundation's Director for International Freedom of Expression. And then there is a campaign, Jess, which is a campaign that was launched by multiple organizations, rights organizations. One of them is EFF, to tell Facebook, stop silencing Palestine. So let's listen to Gillian York. Rights groups are demanding answers from Facebook after multiple reports that the social media giant has censored Palestinian content on its platforms, especially during the recent attacks on Gaza and occupied Jerusalem. The letters, signatories including Hamle, Adala, Council on American Islamic Relations, and Jewish Voice for Peace, demanded that Facebook explain how it applies its policies, provide data on all removals, and allow independent researchers to review the removals. Joining us from Berlin to discuss this and more, Gillian York, Electronic Frontier Foundation Director for International Freedom of Expression. Welcome again to Arab Talk, Gillian.
Thank you for having me.
Have you received similar complaints, and what are your findings? What is EFF doing about this?
Yes, absolutely. So EFF has been working with Hamle, with Jewish Voice for Peace, with a variety of other organizations around the region and elsewhere in the world to try to track these issues, to hear from users about what they're experiencing, and to talk to the companies. So I've been part of several meetings with Facebook that included a number of those groups and a number of Palestinians. And what we're seeing is really kind of a range of things occurring. On the one hand, you have demands from the Israeli government to take down certain types of speech, and these are mostly coming from the cyber unit. At the same time, you also have these companies making mistakes of their own accord, and often this is because really of automation and a lack of understanding of local context.
So how much of it is really automation? Because we've seen this like a real uptick, and I should mention that I've been like a lot of my content has been removed, or I've been issued a warning, and it has nothing to do with violating any of the rules, or and then just like I feel like there is no person behind that notice that people like myself and others receive.
Yeah, it's true. At the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of companies had to send workers home for good reason. They couldn't work from their homes on these sensitive content moderation issues. And yet, at the same time, as states have opened up and as people are going back to work, a lot of these companies have failed to put back in place the resources needed to moderate content across the world. And so, automation is itself troublesome in a number of ways, but it's the inputs to the automation made by humans that are particularly troublesome. So one of the examples that we saw a couple weeks back was where Instagram restricted access to Arabic language posts that included hashtags that mentioned Al-Aqsa. And that was because of the fact that Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade is on the US State Department's list of terrorist organizations, which Facebook removes, that Facebook and Instagram remove. And so that was really just a bad input that conflated the name of one of the most important holy sites in Islam with the name of a group that the company does not allow on their platform.
So I know you've mentioned earlier that EFF is planning to issue, I guess, a statement on this. Can you share with us at least some of your asks?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we've worked with, and really this is not an EFF-led campaign. It's a coalition that EFF is a part of. And again, that includes a number of groups throughout the region. And what we're asking is for a few things. On the one hand, we want Facebook to conduct a full and independent public audit of their content moderation policies with respect to Palestine and commit to co-design. So this is really similar to the other asks that we've seen previously. We also want them to be transparent about the requests that they receive from governments, and especially from the Israeli Cyber Unit. And this includes not just the official requests that they receive, but also what's kind of called voluntary requests. And this is when governments use existing user channels to report speech. This is a really problematic practice that companies are not transparent about. And of course, we also want to see more transparency around automation, around how dangerous organizations are classified under Facebook's policy. So if they're using the State Department's list as their guiding list, then they need to be public about that, because users can't comply with rules that they're not even aware of. And lastly, we want to make sure that there's a co-design process with civil society to improve upon these processes and policies.
So why is Facebook obligated to listen to Israel's cyber unit? I mean, is this usual? I mean, is this a common practice?
It's an increasingly common practice. So right now we're seeing a lot of companies kind of torn between, various government regulations around the world. Israel is one of the kind of early governments to buy into this, to try to form a relationship with Facebook, but it's not by any means the only one. The German government, for example, actually made a regulation called the Network Enforcement Act that requires companies to take down certain types of illegal speech within 24 hours or maybe a little bit more. But we're also seeing this come from India, from Mauritius, from Turkey, from all over the world, these kinds of relationships where governments are trying to force these companies' hand to remove speech at their request, or to require a local office. But I think it's really important to note that companies always have a choice in where they put their offices and put their employees. And just like 5-6 years ago, when these companies were starting to open offices in Dubai and we warned them about the country's human rights record, so too did people warn these companies about Israel and its human rights record.
Yeah, but it seems, that they're taking more the side of governments rather than the average person. I mean, the question is, what can the average person do to fight this monopoly and protect his or her freedom of expression?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they are choosing governments, and part of the reason why they're choosing them is that they can't profit if they get blocked by a government. If Facebook, doesn't comply with Israel or doesn't comply with India, then those governments might block Facebook.com, and then obviously the company's interest, their primary motivator is profit. So what the average person can do is, obviously it differs from where you are. I think it's really important that people get involved when they're living in a democracy in opposing the bad bills that are coming out of a variety of places, including the US and the European Union. But obviously that's not a process that everyone has the ability or right to engage in. And so there's also this, kind of opportunity to engage with the companies and to push them on these things individually, because ultimately they do hold a lot of the power here. And even if they do get blocked, as we saw happen with Twitter in Nigeria this past week, people often find a way around that censorship. And so I think it's really important that we kind of almost treat these companies, as troubling as this sounds, almost treat them like governments in the way that we advocate toward them.
Well, I mean, this is exactly what I was going to ask you, because Facebook and other platforms hide behind the terms of service. And a lot of people don't understand what are these terms of service. Sounds to me like me going to a grocery store and then they have a sign saying no shoes, no shirt, no service, right? But they are acting like a government. I mean, they're bigger than a government. So,
yeah,
I mean, I just want to know, they're bigger than any government, really. So I just want to know, I mean, with your conversations with them, are they listening? Are they listening to organizations like yours and others, that there is an inherently problem with their basically censorship ideas?
Yeah, I mean, it's true. They're bigger than any government, and they have, as much power over our speech as a number of governments do, right? So I would say, they do take calls with us. I don't always feel like they're listening, and I'm going to be really frank about this. Over the years, I've had numerous conversations with people at Facebook in particular, but also plenty of other companies. But since this campaign's focused on Facebook, I'll say this. I feel like there's, kind of an internal struggle there where you do have great people who take these calls and talk to us, but ultimately the power is coming from the executives and the board, and they're the ones who are also set to profit the most off of these decisions. And so, when Facebook hires Nick Clegg, a former politician from the UK, you can see, what its motivation and what its priorities are. And so I think it's really important that these companies change course quickly.
Yeah, and I don't know if they're going to do that because now you said something very important which people don't discuss, which is the dollar sign, which is the profit. And this reminds me actually of the question of how the behavior of American media, like for example, I used to when I used to talk to students, and I'll just make the argument that the news is very sanitized in the United States because Cheerios does not want you to choke on your cereal as you're watching the blood and gore when, of course, you've traveled all over the world. I mean, these images are shown in the Middle East and other places. So the role of, advertising plays a big part. So now what you're saying is it's actually bigger than this, that Facebook, they're not really worried about not receiving ads from a particular company because they don't like what they see on their platform. But you're saying that an entire country can just block Facebook and then they won't get any revenues or viewership or anything in that country.
Yeah, I mean, we've already seen, a number of advertiser boycotts happen around Trump and around hate speech in the US. And these were partially effective, but I wouldn't say, I think it's really hard to get the world's advertisers on board to something like that. And I think there's always someone else who's willing to do that when an advertiser pulls out. And so really, I see these companies as much more caught between governments and between these various regulations. And so it is a really difficult struggle, but this is why I think that it's so important that we don't just write off these platforms. I mean, yes, there's all sorts of things we need to build. We need to build alternative platforms. We need to build other governance models. I mean, all of this. But at the same time, I've always taken the realistic approach that people are going to use Facebook, whether we say to boycott it or not, whether we like it or not. And so it's really important to improve upon that space. And that's why, I think just continuing to put pressure on these companies, because they do respond to public pressure. We've seen this time and time again with various policies, from their real names policy to some of their policies around gender. And now with the oversight board, we're seeing, Facebook change some of its policies in response to their decisions. So that kind of pressure can work. But I think we have to be really diligent about it.
And there is an internal, I think I've seen internal memo or a campaign within Facebook that employees basically have written about it, that this is that they weren't happy with this policy. So do you expect whatever you're going to put out soon that Facebook is going to actually pay attention? Is this going to be just like opening a conversation with them, or are they going to have a response or totally ignore it?
Well, so we've already opened a conversation with them, and that hasn't been going so well, and that's why we chose to take this tactic. But I think that the thing is, a campaign like this with the signatories that we have. I wish I could name them, but I don't know when this is going up. But with the signatories that we have, I think that, this is the kind of pressure that works. And we've seen it work before. In 2018, we were pushing for Facebook to implement an appeals policy, which they did not have fully at the time. We got more than 100 organizations from a variety of different countries around the world to sign on. And Facebook responded publicly. And I don't recall them doing that in that kind of fashion before. So I do think that we're seeing a sea change. And I think that they're being forced to be responsive to civil society. But, it takes a lot of work on our part. So the more people involved, the better.
So what's your advice to people who are really getting frustrated? I mean, what course of action can they do? Can they reach out to these different organizations, your organization, right? Facebook? I mean, sometimes like you want to hit your head against the wall because it's not like Facebook is like a small company or you pick up your phone and talk to someone, right?
Exactly. Well, so for this campaign, they can go to stopsilencingpalestine.com, I think. In general, reach out to the various organizations working on this. We can all use some help. I know, reaching Facebook itself can be kind of difficult if you're an ordinary person, but jumping on one of these campaigns and helping us out is a great way to do that. But I think also, don't forget your legislators. And, don't forget that there are alternatives out there. We don't have to give Facebook all of our data. We can choose to vote with our feet. And, as much as I have resisted that in the past on the grounds that these are the places where the conversation is happening, the more we see Facebook kind of resist change, the more I think it's time for us to look at other places online and create other spaces.
Gillian York, thank you for coming on Arab Talk.
Always wonderful. Thank you.
That's the voice and the face of Gillian York, the international director for the EFF. And Jamal, I have to say, very compelling, very excellent discussion, and she's spot on. And, the thing that I have concerns about is the power that Facebook and other social media have to work in concert with government narratives to silence free speech, especially the free speech of people who happen to be critical of the apartheid regime of Israel, which continues to engage in a pattern and a practice of ethnic cleansing and war crimes. And if anybody, including congressmen and women, we've seen attacks on Ilhan Omar again, for bringing up the possibility of investigating Israel for war crimes. We see Facebook, which is a social media site, being used, by the Israeli government, it seems, and also by the U.S. government to silence pro-Palestine activists. This is incredibly important. It's not getting any mention in the mainstream media, and I'm very concerned about it.
Yeah, it's very, very disturbing, but there is, again, this campaign is very important, and actually there are multiple campaigns. There is another campaign also calling on journalists to reframe the Hasbara, what I call them Hasbara talking points and Hasbara words, like when they're referring to the West Bank as disputed territory, or when they're talking about Sheikh Jarrah, they're talking about it as if it's a real estate transaction rather than the ethnic cleansing of families from Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, and they're avoiding to talk about the occupation. They're avoiding to talk about apartheid. So there is also another campaign that journalists have been signing, and surprisingly, many of them from well-known organizations. Of course, some signed anonymously, like people who work for CNN, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. I mean, this whole kind of lingo that was established by Israel and by AIPAC in this country, in how what can they refer to, what can they use as words,
right,
is now and hopefully is changing, and so we're going to go to another interview, Jess, which is an interview with Zena Ashrawi Hutchinson, Palestinian American activist, and actually she was a DNC delegate from Virginia. But before that, and we'll kind of go to her interview, I wanted to play this video clip by Secretary Blinken.
Outrageous.
He had a Zoom call or talk with Representative Ilhan Omar, who asked him where Palestinians can seek justice if the U.S. won't support like an ICC investigation. And Blinken's response was from Israel and the United States because they are democracies.
Oh my God. It's so insulting, Jamal. It's so insulting to hear the Secretary of State disrespect a congresswoman like Ilhan Omar and disrespect the reality of the ground, on the ground for Palestinians, and the fact that the United States would reject the ICC, which the rest of the world, I mean, the only two countries that reject the ICC are the United States and the Israeli, apartheid regime. They're the only ones that will reject this international call to bring justice to the war crimes that the Israelis have been engaged in for so many decades now. And, this is part of the larger picture that Secretary Blinken seems more like a mouthpiece for the Israeli Prime Minister's office and the Israeli government than he is acting on behalf of what is the strategic best interest of the United States. And I would argue that the strategic best interest of the United States is not mimicking Israeli talking points. So there is a move, Jamal. Unfortunately, we have to be honest about this, right? There are Palestinians in the United States who are kind of on board with, Secretary Blinken, unfortunately. And we have to look at that. I mean, we've talked about this over the years, and it's a very sad and unfortunate reality that we have to take on.
So let's watch Secretary Blinken's discussion or talk with Representative Ilhan Omar.
It's not really a discussion, but
then we'll go to our interview with Zaina Ashrawi Hutchinson.
Mr. Secretary, I do understand that point. I'm asking what mechanisms you think is available to them.
I believe that we have, whether it's the United States or Israel, we both have the mechanisms to make sure that there is accountability in any situations where there are concerns about the use of force and human rights, etc. I believe that both of our democracies have that capacity, and we've demonstrated it, and we'll need to continue to demonstrate it going forward.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has met with a group of Palestinian Americans who he labeled as leaders in a tweet on June 5th. No names were officially announced, and neither was the meeting made public. A statement by more than 500 Palestinian Americans opposed the meeting, considering the closed-door gathering an attempt to circumvent grassroots leaders and to divide the Palestinian American community. Zaina Ashrawi Hutchinson, a Palestinian American activist and DNC delegate from Virginia, is one of the signatories on the petition. Welcome to Arab Talk, Zaina.
Thank you, Jamal. It's my pleasure to be here.
So, why did you denounce Blinken's meeting?
Well, first of all, community leaders did not know anything about this meeting until the last second. I'm going to start with this. Us Palestinians, not just in the United States, but on the ground in Palestine, have mobilized from the grassroots civil society. All of us have mobilized to speak with one voice and to speak with agency on our cause and to take back the reins of our issues. So when we have a group of people meeting behind the scenes to discuss issues that pertain to all of us without prior knowledge, without discussions, that's what caused the main issues in the first place, like Oslo, like the status quo from before. And for us here in America, the grassroots in particular decided that it is unacceptable, once we found out, it is unacceptable for anybody to meet with the State Department. Particularly now, the blood of Palestinians in Gaza haven't dried yet. The $735 million that has been proposed as the bombing was still happening almost, essentially. And nobody said anything about it from the Americans or the Israelis. And then you have these group of people meeting behind closed doors to discuss and talk about these things. What we stress in the grassroots here in the United States and also in Palestine is unity. Unity behind the Palestinian cause, unity behind the Palestinian voice, unity behind the agency of our representation. For a long time, there was a hold on dissemination of information, behind, like I said, behind the scenes conversation, and led to catastrophic, illegitimate deals. We won't let that happen anymore. The streets are talking, and politicians need to start listening, quite frankly.
How did you find out about this meeting, and did you reach out to any of the participants?
So we found out by somebody who participated sent a quick a quick text message the night before, really late at night. A few of us mobilized to tell them, we're boycotting this meeting. You should not be attending this meeting. The next morning at 10:30, they refused. So, the grassroots, we mobilized and we wrote the statement. And it's, speaks for itself. I think it's important for the State Department to understand that they can no longer divide the Palestinian narrative. They can no longer pick and choose whom they speak to and what voices they listen to, because the voices that are speaking in unison at this point. That unless there is serious sanctions and unless there is serious accountability, we won't really discuss anything further. So we found out really in secrecy. We told them that we were going to have a statement to rebut the situation. They still went ahead with the meeting, so we released the statement.
I don't know if you saw this recent video, which became viral on social media. Representative Ilhan Omar asked the Secretary of State where Palestinians can seek justice if the U.S. won't support ICC investigations. And Blinken's response was from Israel and the U.S. because they are democracies. Any thoughts on this?
I mean, it's absurd. I don't know if they're trying to fool themselves or fool everybody around them, but everybody sees the legitimacy of moderation that the United States or legal action that the United States has taken. They've blocked ceasefire statements. They've successive administrations. We're not just talking about one. Not just blocked resolutions recently on the ceasefire, resolutions condemning Israel's war crimes over time, even denouncing anything that has to do with asking for human rights of the Palestinian people. The U.S. has always and continuously been the main force behind blocking these efforts internationally. The previous administration sanctioned judges. So we're not under any illusion that this administration or any previous administration has the interests of the Palestinian people at heart, which is why we are commending the ICC for taking the next steps into investigating Israel and the atrocities that have been committed, not just recently, but over time. This is the latest from the ICC. So I think it's absolutely absurd. And I think now that people have access to information and know exactly what is happening, this ruse of a peace process and moderating, them being the moderator, is completely laughable.
So you were part, of course, of the Palestinian American delegates who attended the virtual Democratic National Party's meeting to draft its platform. You came away, the group, largely disappointed. Shortly after that, I've actually had a conversation with someone you know very well, Huwaid Arraf, and we discussed on this very show what happened. So when Secretary Blinken and President Biden keep repeating the statement, Israel has the right to defend itself, disregarding Palestinian suffering, the brutal occupation and apartheid conditions they live under, is this a result of the Democratic Party really blind support to Israel? I mean, are we seeing any change, or it's just same old, and they're just going to keep repeating the same old stuff?
Well, I mean, we see that they are repeating the same old stuff. The difference is now they're being held accountable and being called out for doing it. When we were the delegates, there's an amazing group of Palestinian delegates and allies who worked tirelessly to pressure the Biden campaign at the time, as well as the DNC, to take a firm stand on the most basics of human rights and rights of the Palestinian people, like putting equity or equality in the and I'm sure you discussed this, equity or equality in the platform, like discussing the ethnic cleansing of Jerusalem in the most mundane terms, not even in any controversial issues. Everything was blocked, and that is, they keep talking about policy versus politics. American policy and politics have not changed. What is changing is the grassroots are speaking up. People are being held accountable. And those of us who work on the ground do realize that our influence is growing not just because we speak up, but because we attend and we question the candidates before they become elected officials in order for us to hold them accountable later. For example, recently here in Virginia, and in fact today are the primaries, so people are voting as I'm speaking, we had a people's debate. And one of the questions that I asked the lieutenant governor, or the governors, the people running for governor is, do you support the boycott, divestment, sanction movement? And everybody was stunned that that question was even asked. Even before I asked the question, people were like, oh, you need to be careful. We shouldn't ask this. This would go. And to me, this is a very simple question to ask. So breaking these barriers of taboo questions and engaging with those who, before they become elected, holding them accountable after they become elected, and then showing that the streets are speaking, and it's not just the Palestinians. We have allies from all the movements around us, because Palestine is no longer an isolated issue. It's no longer a foreign policy issue that people can, push to the side and say we don't have to deal with it. This is something that people now understand. They are here in the United States. They're paying for, they're responsible for, and they can do something about it. So while the old guard, if you will, are still there and doing the exact same thing, they're up against a big, massive movement that is coming directly in their path. Hold them accountable.
Well, I think this is very important. I mean, we've talked about Secretary Blinken, and I think they're just towing the line, and President Biden. But we've seen a shift in Congress,
Yes.
not enough. I mean, you have Ilhan Omar, you have Rashida Tlaib, you have Jamal Bowman, you have new faces, newcomers, Representative McCollum introducing a bill.
Yes.
I mean, do you feel that the U.S. public opinion shifting on Palestine?
Absolutely, 100%. I think with bills like 2590 from the amazing Betty McCollum and support the progressives in Congress, they are laying the groundwork for what's to come. And we need that support. And we understand that it takes courage. We understand that we are going against the grain, if you will. We understand that we are up against propaganda machines. We're up against a massive lobby, if the strongest, if not one of the strongest. We are up against decades of oppression and decades of propaganda that's been entrenched in the American psyche and American media. To the point where people are terrified to even say Palestine, whereas now, slowly the narrative is changing in the United States. And with the presence of these incredible progressives in Congress, I think definitely momentum and public opinion is shifting, but it's not enough. And I'm urging everybody to realize that it may take a little bit of courage to start, but once you see the flood of support that people get when you stand up for truth and justice and Palestinian liberation, it is freeing, because you're not beholden, really. You're not stained by supporting apartheid and ethnic cleansing. And I think it's becoming more and more apparent. I mean, talking about right now, current events, like talking about Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan and Lifta and all of these places in Palestine that are currently being ethnically cleansed. People are just realizing this, but this has been going on for such a long time. While we commend everybody for speaking up, this is policy. Ethnic cleansing is policy. So in order for us to combat that policy, that shift in Congress, not just in the grassroots, needs to happen. And I see it happening, and I'm very proud of it. It's fabulous to see. In fact, for organizing around 2590 is such a brilliant way to do it, because it's not just advocacy for Palestinian rights. It's advocacy, it's education. When people ask us, what do you mean they tear down Palestinian homes? And then we talk about, the different villages that have been torn down and parks being built on those villages, like Canada Park over Amwas and Ya'lu. These are such important conversations that have gone unspoken for such a long time and hidden because of the control over the media, that now people can't stand blindly with Israel without feeling like they are condemning ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and settler colonialism, period.
I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, ethnic cleansing is ongoing I should mention, in the city of your birth, Jerusalem, and also my city of my birth. There is definitely a major grassroots global outcry I don't see that impact still moving the administration. I mean, from what I've heard, when we're, when the Biden administration want to send $700+ million to Israel, when you have a senator going to Israel and saying that Israel is ready to ask for an additional $1 billion to replenish its military hardware and bombs and missiles that it dropped on Gaza. What gives, really? What gives?
I think for us, primarily, we need to keep demanding and speaking up, but we also need to realize that this is not going to happen overnight. This is going to take time, but it's building. And so while we may feel like it needs to happen tomorrow, and it should, I mean, all of us agree that this needs to end right now, yesterday, the policy of the United States is not going to change overnight. And public opinion on everything is not going to change overnight. So what we need to do is keep building on the progressive momentum, keep building on the knowledge that people now have, and the access that people now have, and to tug on people's moral compass, the moral value of what they see is important to them as human beings, not just politics. Things like, statements like putting Hamas as a divider, essentially, between the Palestinian people and Israel. This is a way to divide the people and kind of change the narrative completely from the unity that the Palestinian people have had, and the apparent shift in public opinion and approach to, well, then they're terrorists. The problem with that is that neither Israel nor the United States have the right to decide Palestinians, if who are the civilians and who aren't. Every single Palestinian has the right to resist, period, full stop. So the change that is happening is not going to happen overnight, but conversations need to keep happening. And like I said, with 2590 and other conversations, and now activists rising up and people like us in the DNC, not sitting back and being okay with status quo, challenging these behind the scenes meetings that are taking our narrative away from us, from the people on the ground in Palestine who are speaking out and telling us in unison, stand together for our cause because we need to stay together, is extremely important. And quickly, to talk about the ethnic cleansing of Jerusalem, it is what we see on the ground. There are like three important issues. It's not just the ethnic cleansing of Jerusalem in and of itself. This is a policy. This is what Israel is literally built on: the demolition of villages and homes and towns, and building these completely foreign entities on top of our history and our narrative. This is not new. This is fact. The second thing is the ethnic cleansing is not just on the ground. It is also all kinds of ethnic cleansing on social media, the erasure of our history, the creation of new narratives that never really existed, the dismantlement of them, and normalizing terminology like evictions, or like I said, terrorism when it comes to counter, violence versus violence. There is no violence versus violence. This is an oppressor against an oppressed. This is a captive people under a brutal blockade for 14 years plus, who are facing indiscriminate bombardment by the most powerful country, one of the most powerful countries in the world, with support of one of the most powerful countries in the world. And lastly, these are war crimes. We're not talking about people going to the grocery store and buying tissues or something. These are war crimes that are being committed against a defenseless people that have been calling out for the international community and the United States to take a firm stand, to have a moral compass, to really see Israel for what it is, a settler colonialist regime, an apartheid regime. And so now that this is all being spoken up about with TikTok, with Instagram, even with the censorship, mind you, even with the ethnic cleansing, with the complete denial of our attempt, they're being spoken up about. And so while not tomorrow, I'm a firm believer that if these guys don't take it upon themselves, we will.
Well, actually, you've mentioned the censorship and social media. I'm actually having a conversation right after you with Gillian York from the Electronic Frontier Foundation to talk about this. But shifting public opinion comes with shifting also the narrative through the media.
Yes.
And the Palestinians recently were happy to see that the New York Times, for the very first time, putting the faces of Palestinian children on its front page, and of course received a lot of critic. But my question is, why now? I mean, all these years, all what happened throughout these decades of ethnic cleansing, of the killing of children, of home demolitions, and then this is the first time that the New York Times, of course, did that after the Israeli Haaretz newspaper published these. I mean, do you feel, is there a shift also in the media, or is it kind of like a token after all this pressure? Let's humanize Palestinians for a change.
I would like to think there's a shift. I think it's a minimal shift in the media, and we have to recognize that. I mean, putting the faces of dead Palestinian children on the front page of the New York Times is a huge step. But then you read the other articles that are written and all over, and not just written, spoken on mainstream media. There's still the same thing. They still dehumanize Palestinians and blame us for our own death. So there's a very, very slight shift, but even that shift is kind of absurd. Do you know what, if I'm making any sense? The fact that and people are speaking up against putting Palestinian children who are dead on the front pages. I mean, we are touching people, and there's clearly momentum. The Israeli propaganda machine is afraid. That said, I think that has a long way to go, and the media has realized that part of the reason why they do have to start reporting on the actual truth that's happening on the ground is because people are circumventing them, and pretty soon they'll be obsolete, and shows like yours, Mr. Jamal, will become the voice, and have become the voice that people will listen to get the truth. Because we now realize from watching social media, those kids and youth on the ground in Palestine, and adults, speaking up honestly, unabashed, truthfully about settler colonialism and the impact it's having, not just on the ground there, but on all of us. This is a 73-year-old systemic oppression that has gone on. The ethnic cleansing is also, I mean, another thing with the death and the destruction and ethnic cleansing and all of it. It's not just on the ground in Palestine, you see. The trauma from 73 years ago comes with us wherever we go, whether we are exiled, whether we become refugees, whether it's all part of it. So I think the movement now is because Palestinians in the United States and elsewhere, and our allies, I have to say, we have a brilliant allies who support us and walk beside us. Because we have taken the reins from the elected officials, because we have really spoken up and stopped these behind the scenes conversations that have stopped and tried to divide us for such a long time. The shift is happening, and they're not going to have much of a choice but to come with us. But it's people like me, for example, and like you. We are here and we are speaking up. The ethnic cleansing, for example, I was exiled in 2009. And I've been speaking more and more about this because I think it's important for people to realize that ethnic cleansing right now in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan is very, very real. They're actually demolishing, I think they said 150 homes. Today it was announced, or Palestinian homes. They have to demolish them by themselves, or the municipality, or pay the municipality to do it. I mean, that's cruelty and dehumanization. But then you also look at the fact that people like us, I came to the United States to study. I did not leave my home. I just came as a student. I didn't have an American passport. I went back to Palestine to visit my family after a certain, when my child was born, did all the protocols, got the visa on my Israeli travel document that I was issued to go home. And when
you shouldn't be forced to obtain a visa to return to your birthplace. But anyway,
exactly, and we're forced to do it. We're humiliated to do it. If you don't do it, you won't go. They won't let you in. So we still were humiliated to walk into the embassy and ask for a visa to return to my birthplace, where my parents still live. After a hassle, they gave me my visa. I go home. At the airport, they keep me and my child, who was 10 months old at the time. For 6 hours, my father is still waiting outside. And when they finally let us go after so much pressure, they told me I had 2 weeks to go to the Ministry of Interior and change my documents or do whatever it is that I needed to do. And when I went and tried to talk to them and tell them, this is my home, you can't take my ID away, blah, 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 they gave me a travel document. And on the travel document, they said that my nationality was undefined. This this is ethnic cleansing. This is not just a paper. This is denial of my existence as a Palestinian. And then after they did this, when I left, they took my ID. And now for a year, actually, I stayed in the United States on a green card, did not have any other documentation to travel or to go home if I needed to. And so now I'm an American. My children and my husband are Palestinian with West Bank ID numbers. And I am an American, born and raised in Palestine. So, I mean, the absurdity of it is laughable, but it's also extremely painful and systematic and very well studied. Our erasure is ingrained in the political system there, but it's also ingrained in the political system here. And so to change that, we have to change hearts and minds, but we also have to change policy. And we are working on that on every level. But the beauty of this movement, Jamal, and the pride I have in being a minute part in it is the unity and the selflessness and the pure solidarity and the authenticity of the fight that has taken over, which motivates everybody around us, is just breathtaking. So I see it. I see the movement happening. My heart still aches every day when I see the news back home. But we're not stopping. We won't stop fighting for this, whether on the ground or here. This is our right. Liberation is our right. It's not a gift, like I said in one of my statements. And we don't ask for permission to end apartheid. We demand it. And we don't ask for permission to free Palestine. We demand it, and we will continue.
Zaina Ashrawi Hutchinson, thank you for coming on Arab Talk.
Thank you so much, Jamal. It's my pleasure.
That's the voice and the face of Zaina Ashrawi Hutchinson, DNC representative from Virginia. And Jamal, I can't agree with her more. Why should we support the efforts of the State Department right now and their so-called efforts to simply just extend the colonial occupation of historic Palestine right now? I am on board with everything she said. I'm on board with the petition. And let me ask you a question. Do you think it's getting any play in the mainstream media?
No, not really. I mean, listen, if you look at the meeting itself, and I understand why people were upset, there was a group of Palestinians, as you've mentioned. They've met with the secretary. The secretary put a tweet last week saying, "I've met with Palestinian leaders," without putting leaders between quotes. So people were surprised without naming
the leaders.
Who were these leaders are, and without
who selected the leaders,
without anyone actually knowing anything about the agenda, what they were going to be discussing. And it came on the heels of just the United States, saying that's going to give Israel over $700 million. And then also the Israelis are ready to submit a request for an additional $1 billion to replenish their missiles, I guess they used, and ammunition they used on Gaza. So the timing of the meeting was horrible. The optics of the meetings were horrible. And then, people were questioning this. And so my understanding is a group of 4 women, one of them is Zaina Ashrawi Hutchinson. They started this campaign in which more than 500 Palestinian Americans telling to people, hey, hold on, don't meet. I mean, let's discuss it. I guess they didn't adhere to this campaign, and they've met. And we have yet to know all the full details. We've got some information here and there of what transpired, but my understanding also is after the meeting, the secretary met also with pro-Israel groups, representatives of different organizations, and I'm sure under the umbrella of AIPAC. So the whole idea is for the Secretary of State, I mean, this is at a time when they have been repeating time and time again that we are 100% behind Israel. Israel can do no wrong. Israel is a democracy. Israel has the right to defend itself. to sit down and say, well, I've met with Palestinian leaders.
Yeah, it's so insulting.
I mean, about what?
Yeah, about what? Well, there's many things that are wrong with that articulation. First of all, as you said, Jamal, and I can't agree with you more, for Secretary Blinken to say that without identifying the leaders means that there's something to hide. Without talking transparently about what they spoke about and, the details of how they were selected, the lack of transparency suggests that these tactics that the State Department and Blinken and the Biden administration are doing are simply to extend the Israeli colonial project and to go along with Israeli Hasbara. The majority of Palestinians in this country do not support the U.S. policy of the two-state solution, the fake two-state solution, and they certainly don't support the idea of continuing to give the Israelis billions of dollars every year to kill and to ethnically cleanse Palestinians. But Jamal, as I said, the fact that these individuals were not named, and you and I know who these people are.
It's now public. I mean,
Yeah.
it just took everyone by surprise, and a few of them had said earlier, we were part of this meeting. But again, when you have a meeting, an important meeting between the Palestinian community and the Secretary of State, you have to have preparation, you have to have an agenda, you have to have talking points, you have to be inclusive. I mean, I don't want us to kind of like sidetrack and go after these people, but, like who were they, what did they represent, and all of this. But the whole idea of having a meeting without just the community knowing all about it in advance and providing input.
That's my point. That's the point, Jamal.
It's just ludicrous when, at the end of the day, I mean, the Secretary of State is going to say, Israel has the right to defend itself. Let's talk about this and that, and not really address the real issues.
Well, and the reality is, Jamal, this does not address the root issues of the ethnic cleansing and the Israeli colonial project against Palestine. And that's really the issue. They're holding on to the fiction of the Israeli view of the two-state solution, which is essentially the Oslo agreements that have been whittled down to more Israeli settlers, more colonial expansion, more domination and control of Palestinian land, which has been stolen, and more control and domination of the natural resources and the people. This is not something that Palestinians would ever agree to. So for him to say that he met with Palestinian leaders and the way in which he did it is nothing more than just a sideshow to show that the Biden administration is firmly behind the Israeli Hasbara machine. But I'll tell you, Jamal, not all members of Congress are on board with this. And that's some of the shift that we're seeing. We're seeing the grassroots in the Democratic Party. We're seeing Congress, men and women, and even some senators who are not on board with this Israeli plan, with the American-Israeli coordination on this. And certainly we're beginning to hear more about how it is not in the U.S. strategic interest to continue to support the Israeli apartheid regime in the way it has been for so many decades.
Well, you're absolutely right, Jess. And, I started by saying that really Palestinians now are reclaiming their narrative. And that's why
people have to listen, though, Jamal. People have to listen.
That's why people are not paying attention to all these articles. They're not paying attention to what AIPAC puts out there. And people watch when I just give you the recent example of what happened in Sheikh Jarrah, what's happening now in Silwan. Hundreds of thousands of people are retweeting those horrific pictures and images of the Israelis beating Palestinian families, arresting children. They're not waiting to see those on CNN. They are not waiting to read a press release issued by the Secretary of State. They can see these in real time. And this is a grassroots movement that people are seeing the injustice. And then therefore, people have to think very hard. And if Palestinians want to have a real strong voice, well, maybe they should elect their own leaders in the United States.
Well,
be open to everyone. So when somebody goes and meets with the Secretary of the State or meets with President Biden, at least he or she has a constituency behind them.
Well, that's exactly right, Jamal. But I think we need to go back to the point that Jillian made and the point of all of this. Yes, Palestinians are claiming their narrative. Pro-Palestine forces are able to tweet and retweet and post on Facebook. The problem is these social media organizations have the power to block, limit, edit, and take down the Palestinian narrative. And, Jamal, here in the Bay Area, we don't have time to talk about it on this show, Free Palestine graffiti is popping up all over the Bay Area, and the JCC has announced that if they see basically Free Palestine anywhere, that's considered an anti-Semitic statement. So,
unbelievable. So
this is where we're at, Jamal, that when you advocate for self-determination for Palestinians, it gets articulated as an anti-Semitic, statement. This is why Max's article on the weaponization of anti-Semitism in the Israeli Hasbara machine is so important, and we need to refer back to that as much as possible.
Well, you're not going to keep us silent. We're going to keep talking about the truth. You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download all our shows right there, and we will see you next week.
We'll see you next week.